The invasion that shocked the world in the early hours of February 24, 2022. Europe woke up to a nightmare it believed belonged to the history books. Explosions echoed across Kyiv, Kharkiv, Mariupol, and dozens of cities as Russian missiles rained down on Ukraine. The skies glowed with fire. Sirens filled the streets, and millions of people realized that this was no border incident, no limited strike. This was a full-scale invasion. Russia had launched the biggest military attack in Europe since World War II. For decades, Europe had lived under the belief that war on this scale was impossible. Diplomacy, trade, and shared economic ambitions were supposed to prevent such conflicts. But Russia's move shattered every assumption. It was not just an attack on Ukraine. It was an attack on the entire European security system built after 1945. Why did this happen? Why did Russia choose war at a time when the world was connected, interdependent, and supposedly wiser than its past? To answer this, we must go back years, through the collapse of the Soviet Union, the struggle for influence in Eastern Europe, and the growing rivalry between Moscow and the West. Ukraine had always been more than a neighbor to Russia. Historically, economically, culturally, Ukraine was central to Moscow's vision of itself. Losing Ukraine in 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed, was seen by the Kremlin as the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the century. From Russia's perspective, Ukraine moving towards Europe was not just a political loss, it was a strategic and psychological defeat. By 2022, Ukraine had become the symbol of the clash between two global models, democracy and authoritarianism. European integration and Russian influence, Western alliances, and Eastern power politics. When Russia attacked, it believed Ukraine was the final frontier, preventing the West from entering what Moscow considered its sphere. But this invasion was not simply about territory or strategic depth. It was about rewriting the post-Cold War order. Russia wanted to send a message: Moscow is back, and it will not tolerate Western expansion. Yet what Russia underestimated was the response of Ukraine, of Europe, and of the entire world. What began as a regional war rapidly grew into an international confrontation. Europe united with unprecedented speed. United States re-entered world leadership. NATO experienced a rebirth. And global powers like India, China, and the Middle East had to choose positions carefully. The Russia-Ukraine war became more than a conflict. It became a turning point in modern history. And its roots go deep into political rivalry, broken promises, energy, power, and a struggle over Europe's future. Why Russia attacked? Power, fear, and miscalculation. To understand why Russia launched such a massive operation, we must examine the motives that shaped the Kremlin's decision. Russia's attack on Ukraine was driven by a complex mix of strategic fears, historical beliefs, and political ambitions. The first and most central factor was NATO expansion. Since the 1990s, NATO had welcomed former Soviet-controlled Eastern European states like Poland, Hungary, and the Baltic countries. Every expansion brought NATO closer to Russia's borders. And in Moscow's strategic doctrine, this was not just a political threat, it was a military one. Russian policymakers believed that if Ukraine ever joined NATO, Western missiles could be stationed minutes away from Moscow. This idea was unacceptable to the Kremlin. But there was more. Ukraine's tilt toward Europe threatened Russia's influence at a deeper level. The 2014 Euromaidan Revolution, which toppled a pro-Russian president and brought a pro-European government to power, was seen in Moscow as a direct attack by the West. When Ukraine signed cooperation agreements with the European Union, Russia felt the ground shifting beneath it. Another key motivation was Putin's ideological vision. He openly denied Ukrainian nationhood, claiming Russians and Ukrainians were one people. This belief went far beyond politics. It was about identity, history, and Russia's need to restore what it considered its rightful sphere of influence. Putin feared that a democratic Ukraine integrated with Europe would inspire Russians to question their own authoritarian system. Economic and military calculations also played a role. Ukraine holds massive agricultural resources, industrial centers, and important shipping routes through the Black Sea. For Russia, controlling Ukraine meant expanding economic power and strengthening Russia's position toward Europe. But perhaps the greatest miscalculation was Russia's belief that Europe was divided and weak. Moscow expected that European dependence on Russian gas would prevent a strong response. It believed NATO was slow and bureaucratic, and that the United States was distracted by China. Russia thought Ukraine would collapse within days, but the opposite happened. Europe united, NATO strengthened. Ukraine resisted with extraordinary courage. The United States emerged as the architect of global support for Kyiv. The war that Russia expected to be a swift victory turned into a long, exhausting conflict. What began as a power move became a gamble that shook Russia's economy, military, and international standing. Why Europe entered the war and how the world split into blocs. Europe's involvement did not come from alliance obligations, as Ukraine is not a NATO member. Europe entered the conflict because this war challenged everything the continent believed in: sovereignty, democracy, and the right of nations to choose their own future. European leaders understood one simple truth: if Russia succeeded in Ukraine, Europe would be next. The Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, were already warning Europe that the Kremlin's ambitions would not stop at Kyiv. Poland, with its difficult history with Russia, insisted that this war was existential. And Germany, long criticized for being soft on Moscow, finally realized the danger of relying on Russian gas. Europe faced a dilemma: act strongly, or allow a major war to reshape the continent. The choice was clear. Sanctions were imposed. Billions in weapons and humanitarian aid flowed to Ukraine. European countries opened their doors to millions of Ukrainian refugees. The European Union began reducing dependence on Russian energy, a transformation that would have taken decades without the urgency of war. NATO gained new life. Finland and Sweden abandoned decades of neutrality and chose to join the alliance. Europe recognized that peace required strength, unity, and clarity. But beyond Europe, the war transformed the entire global order. The world divided into three broad groups: the Western Bloc, Europe, United States, Canada, Japan, South Korea, Australia. These countries supported Ukraine politically, economically, and militarily. The Eurasian Bloc, Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, these states, each for their own reasons, opposed Western influence and supported Russia through energy deals, political backing, and in some cases arms. The non-aligned balancing powers, India, Turkey, Gulf states, most of Africa, South America. These countries chose strategic neutrality, using the situation to balance their interests without fully joining either side. This division reshaped everything: trade, energy markets, diplomacy, military alliances, and perceptions of power. The Russia-Ukraine war produced a new geopolitical map that continues to shape international politics today. India, the United States, and the future of a divided world. No global conflict is complete without understanding the role of major powers beyond the battlefield. In this war, two countries played especially important roles: India and the United States. India's strategic neutrality. India refused to take sides. It neither condemned Russia harshly nor supported the invasion. Instead, it adopted a position of calculated neutrality. Why? Because India's interests demanded balance. Russia is India's longtime military supplier, as most of India's fighter jets, tanks, and missiles come from Russia. India could not risk breaking this relationship overnight, especially with increasing tensions with China. At the same time, India needs strong relations with the United States and Europe for investment, technology, and strategic support. So India walked a tightrope, buying discounted Russian oil, refusing to join Western sanctions, but supporting peace and stability in public statements. India's approach became a model for many countries: protect national interests, avoid emotional decisions, and stay flexible. America's strategic response for the United States, the Russia-Ukraine conflict, was more than a regional war. It was an opportunity to reassert American leadership on the world stage. The U.S. strategy had several goals: weaken Russia's military capabilities, unite Europe under American leadership, reduce European reliance on Russian gas signal to China, that aggression has consequences. Through intelligence sharing, advanced weapons, financial support, and diplomatic pressure, the U.S. became the backbone of Ukraine's resistance. Washington did not send troops, but it shaped every major decision in the Western camp. This conflict also rebalanced global geopolitics. The U.S. regained trust in Europe after years of uncertainty. NATO became stronger, and American influence extended deeper into Eastern Europe, where fears of Russian aggression were highest. The future of the war and the future of Europe. As months turned into years, the war reshaped everything. Global energy markets, military doctrines, alliance structures, and diplomatic calculations. Europe now understands that peace cannot be taken for granted. Security, unity, and deterrence have become essential pillars of its future. Russia, facing sanctions and isolation, turned increasingly toward China. Ukraine, despite the destruction, emerged as a symbol of resistance and European identity. And the rest of the world learned that neutrality, alliances, and strategic interests are more complex than ever. The Russia-Ukraine war began as a regional invasion, but it created a global political earthquake. It forced nations to make choices, reshaped Europe's destiny. It reignited old rivalries and created new alliances. And it showed the world that power still matters, perhaps more than ever. The war is more than a conflict. It is a transformation, the defining chapter of the 21st century. Struggle not just for land, but for the future of global order. And as this chapter continues, one truth is clear. Europe will never be the same again. Russia will never be the same again. And the world, too, has entered a new era, an era of competition, caution, and geopolitical awakening.